She married a sheep herder in rags. He held deeds to 4 river sections. The sheep were already out when I heard the wagon coming down the canyon road. I didn't look up. I was pulling a thorn mat out of a ewe's back left leg, the kind that works in deep and goes septic if you leave it, and I had my jackknife open and my thumb pressed against her hock to keep her still. She was patient about it, that ewe. Most of them aren't. You get a ewe in pain and she'll kick the side of your face off if you give her the angle, but this one just stood and trembled and let me work. The wagon wheel cracked a rock somewhere up the grade. I heard it. I kept cutting. I got the mat out, a knotted plug of burr and dried blood the size of my thumbnail, and packed the hole with pine tar and let her go. She walked off stiff-legged, resentful, which meant she'd be fine by morning. I wiped the knife on my pants and stood up. The wagon was stopped at the top of the trail where it levels off before the drop to the creek. A man was up on the bench looking down at my sheep and my camp and me. He had a city coat on, new, with the crease still in the shoulders. From that distance I couldn't read his face. I could read the coat. I didn't wave. He didn't wave. After a minute he snapped the reins and came on down. His name was Gerald Holt. He told me that before he got down from the wagon. He was a land agent out of Santa Fe, and he had been 2 days finding me, because I moved the flock every 10 days, and nobody on the road had bothered to keep track of where I was. I said that was generally the idea. He didn't smile. Men who wear new coats in the backcountry rarely do. He had papers. They were rolled in oilcloth, and he handed them to me like they were something I'd been waiting for, which I had not. I unrolled them and looked at them in the afternoon light, and they were deeds. 4 of them. Sections along the Ute Fork, from the first bend below the Ponderosa Grove all the way to where the river widens and slows above the meadow. The water rights were included, everything above ground and everything below. I rolled them back up and handed them to him, and told him to put them somewhere safe because I had nowhere to put them myself. And he looked at me the way men in new coats look at men in old pants, which is a particular kind of look that goes all the way through you and decides on the other side that there isn't much there. He said he'd hold them at the land office in Cimarron until I came for them. I said that was fine. He left before dark. I went back to counting sheep. That was late October. By the time the grass finished curring out and I brought the flock down to winter pasture and settled them in at my brother-in-law's leased ground outside Riado, it was the first week of December. Cold. The kind of cold that moves in behind the elk and doesn't leave until March. I had $23 in my boot and a bedroll that had seen 4 winters and was about to admit it. My brother-in-law was named Augusto Vargas, and he was a decent man who had married a woman smarter than him and spent his life being mostly grateful for that. He had a small house and a family that took up all of it, but he put a cot for me in the barn, and that was more than most would do. The first night I was there, he sat across the fire from me after his wife had gone in, and he looked at me the way men look at each other when they are about to say a thing they have been saving up. He said, "There is a woman." I said I didn't need a woman. He said, "Her name is Celia Fuentes, and she is a widow with 2 boys, 8 and 11, and her husband died of fever in August, and she is in a bad way. She has land but no one to work it. No money to hire help. Her boys are too young. She is talking about taking the boys to her sister in Mora, and I don't think the sister wants them there either." I said I was sorry to hear that. He said, "I told her about you." I didn't say anything for a while. The fire was burning down to coals, and outside the wind was working itself up against the eaves of the barn, and the sheep in the back stalls shifted and muttered the way they do when the temperature drops. I said, "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her you were a good man. I told her you had a flock of your own and managed your own accounts and never broke your word. I did not tell her you were rich because you don't look rich, and I didn't think she'd believe me." I said, "I'm not rich." He said, "You own 4 sections of river land." I said, "I own deeds to 4 sections of river land. That's not the same as being rich. Being rich means you have money in your hand and food in the house. I have $23 and a bedroll." He was quiet for a minute, then he said still. "I said I'd think about it." I thought about it for 4 days. What I thought mostly was that the woman had enough trouble without adding me to it. A sheep herder in worn-out clothes who smelled like lanolin and pine tar and spent 9 months of the year alone on a mountain was not what a widow with 2 boys needed. She needed a man with a house and a payroll and the kind of steadiness that shows up in a place and stays. I had never stayed anywhere for longer than it took to graze through. On the 5th day, I rode to town and met her. She was at the Mercantile when I got there, the older boy beside her, both of them looking at the price of flour, not picking it up, not opening the sack, just reading the handwritten number on the tag the way you read it when you already know you can't afford it. The boy was holding the edge of her coat with one hand. The other hand was in his pocket. She was small, dark-haired, straight-backed. She had a quality of stillness that I recognized because I had seen it in people who have lost something very specific and have decided to keep going without it. Her coat was clean. That was the thing I noticed first. The coat was clean and carefully brushed, in a season when most people's coats were caked with mud from the roads. She had taken care with it. You don't take care with a coat like that unless keeping your dignity costs you something, and you're paying it anyway. I took off my hat. I said my name. She said hers and looked at me with eyes the color of creek water in shade and didn't smile and didn't look away. She said, "My brother-in-law tells me you are reliable." I said, "He is generous." She said, "He also tells me you are plain-spoken." I said, "When there's something to say." She studied me for a moment. The boy was watching me now too, that particular way boys watch a strange man near their mother, measuring, not unfriendly but not open yet either. I looked back at him and nodded. He didn't nod back. That was fine. She said, "I am not looking for a husband, Mr. Calder. I am looking for a way to keep my family together and keep my land, and I have run out of other ideas." I said, "That's a clear way of putting it." She said, "I don't have time to be unclear." I said I'd think about what she'd said. She said she would need an answer within the week. I thought about it on the ride back. What I thought was this: she was telling the truth. She was not looking for a husband. She was looking for a solution, and I happened to be one. That was not romantic, but it was honest, and I had always preferred honesty to romance. I also thought about the boy holding his mother's coat, and the way she had reached without looking down and put her hand over his without breaking stride in the conversation. Small thing. But it was the kind of small thing that tells you who a person is. I rode to Cimarron and collected the deeds. Then I went back to Rayado and told Augusto I would do it. We married on a Saturday in the first week of January in the church in Rayado. It was not a large ceremony. Her boys were there. The older one, Tamaz, standing straight and serious. The younger one, Bito, restless, picking at the hem of his good shirt. Augusto and his wife. The priest, who was old and tired and had married and buried most of the county, and seemed to have arrived at a peaceful arrangement with both activities. And one of Augusto's neighbors who was there, because she needed a witness, and he happened to be passing. Celia wore a dark blue dress that fit her well. Her hair was pinned up and she stood beside me at the altar and said the words clearly, without hesitation, and when it was done, she did not lean into me or take my arm. She stood on her own feet and looked at the priest and said thank you and turned to her boys. I had a ring I had bought in Cimarron, silver plain. I had put it on her finger during the service and she had let me, and then she had looked at it, and then she had looked at me, just for a moment, and I couldn't read what was in the look. I wasn't sure she could either. We drove to her land in the wagon that afternoon. It was 11 miles east of Rayado, up a shallow valley where the ground was flat and winter gray and you could see the mountains to the north and the sky was enormous in every direction. Her house was small, adobe, 2 rooms, solid walls, a wood stove that had been banked and was still throwing some heat when we arrived. The barn was in better shape than the house. Her husband had been a careful man. The boys unloaded the wagon. Tamaz did most of the actual lifting. Bito handed things up from the wagon bed and dropped one thing and picked it up and looked at me. And I said it was all right, and he turned away fast. The way a boy does when he is deciding whether to trust you and hasn't decided yet. Celia showed me the property that first evening, walking the fence lines in the cold while the boys started supper. 40 acres. Good grass in the summer, she said. The creek ran through the southeast corner and didn't go dry until late August most years. She told me what her husband had planted and what had come in and what had not. She told me where the soil went hard and where it was deep. She walked me through it the way a person walks you through something they love and are afraid of losing. She didn't look at me much while she talked. She talked to the land. At the end she said, "I know this is not what you were expecting." I said, "What were you expecting me to expect?" She thought about it. She said, "A woman who was grateful." I said, "You didn't say you'd be grateful. You said you needed a solution." She said, "Yes." I said, "Then we're even." She looked at me then. Something in her face settled slightly. Not softened, that's not the right word. More like a knot that loosens one quarter turn, still holding but breathing. We went in and ate the supper the boys had made, which was beans and salt pork and biscuits that Tamaz had baked himself and gotten right on the second batch. Good biscuits. I told him so, and he stared at his plate and said nothing, and Bito said the first ones had burned, and Tamaz told him to shut up. I slept in the barn the first 2 weeks. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I was her husband in the eyes of the law and the church, but I was not her husband in any other sense, and I wasn't going to act like I was. She hadn't asked for that. She'd asked for a solution, and I was trying to be one. I brought my flock down from Augusto's leased ground and grazed them on her South 40, and inside a week I knew the property as well as she did. The creek was good. The grass was poor in the places she said it was poor and rich in the places she said it was rich. She had been correct about all of it. The boys came out to see the sheep on the second morning. Bito ran at them and the sheep scattered, and I didn't say anything, and Bito stopped running and watched them regroup and looked back at me, waiting. I said they'd settle down in a minute. He watched. They settled. He nodded like he'd known they would. Tamaz was slower to come around. He watched from a distance that first week, doing his chores with the careful attention of a boy who had been the man of the house for 4 months and wasn't sure how to stop being that. I didn't try to move him out of it. You don't move a boy out of something like that by asking him to step back. You do it by being useful in ways he can see. I fixed the north fence the second day, a long run of it that had been leaning badly. Then I repointed the loose stone under the stovepipe collar on the house before the freeze set into the mortar. Small things, things that needed doing. I didn't tell him what I was doing or why. He could see it. By the end of the second week, he was beside me at the fence on the south side, handing me staples without being asked. By the end of the third week, he was asking me questions about the sheep, specific ones, about how I kept records and how I culled and how I timed breeding. I answered straight and he listened hard. He was a serious boy. I was starting to like him. Celia and I were careful with each other. It's the only word for it. She thanked me when I did something useful and I said it needed doing. I asked her about decisions on the property and she answered without evasion, and sometimes she had an opinion and sometimes she didn't, and in either case she said so directly. We ate together and talked about practical things. She was not cold. She was not warm. She was present and honest, and that was more than I had expected. One evening in the middle of the third week, she came out to the barn while I was oiling harness. She sat on the feed trunk across from where I was working and was quiet for a while. I kept working. She said, "Why do you sleep out here?" I said, "You didn't sign up for a full marriage, Mrs. Calder. I don't think it's right to assume." She was quiet again. Then she said, "You're the first person who's called me that." I said, "Mrs. Calder." She said, "No, Mrs. Anyone." My husband's family, his mother, never called me anything but Celia, or sometimes not that. I said, that's a hard thing for a woman. She said she thought he'd married beneath him. I said, did he think so? She said, no, he was a good man, he just wasn't. She stopped. She said he was a good man, that's the honest thing. I said that was enough for most purposes. She looked at me, she said, what made you agree to this? I said you needed something done, I could do it. She said, that's all. I said, what would you want me to say? She thought about it, she said, I want you to say what's true. I said, then yes. That's all it was when I agreed to it. You needed something done and I didn't have anywhere better to be. She waited. I said, but it's not all it is now. She didn't say anything to that. She got up and said good night and went in. I sat there with the harness in my lap for a long time after. February came hard. 3 days of blizzard that put 4 feet of snow across the valley floor and buried the lower fence posts to their midpoints and kept everyone inside. The boys and I dug out the barn the morning after the first big night and worked the sheep out into the paddock where they could reach what hay I had thrown down earlier. Beto slipped in the paddock and sat down hard in the snow and laughed. The kind of laugh a boy makes when he is cold and tired and surprised and genuinely happy, and I laughed too, and Tamaz looked at both of us like we were children, but then he smiled. We were inside a lot that week. The 5 of us in 2 rooms. It is a particular thing being inside with a family when the weather is bad outside. You find out what a household sounds like at the edges. The boys argued and settled and argued again. Celia read to them in the evenings from a Bible she kept on the shelf, not the religious parts, the story parts, and she read well, not like she was performing but like she knew the stories. She cooked. The food was good. I did not know she was that kind of cook. There had not been a reason to find out until now. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, I was mending a saddle blanket by the stove, and she brought me coffee without being asked. She sat across from me with her own cup, and the boys were asleep on their pallets in the back room, and the wind was working hard outside, and the stove was doing its job, and I looked up from the blanket and she was watching me. She said, tell me about the land. I thought she meant her 40 acres, and I started to say something about the south fence, and she shook her head. She said, not this land, your land. I said, Augusto told you. She said, he told me what he knew. He said you had land somewhere, deeds, that you kept them in a land office. I said 4 sections along the Ute Fork, water rights included. She was quiet, then she said, why didn't you tell me? I said, you didn't ask me what I owned. You asked me if I was reliable. She looked at me for a long time. There was something in her face I had not seen before. I couldn't name it then. Later, I decided it was the first time she had been caught off balance by me, and it had opened something up. Some door she hadn't known was there. She said, were you waiting to see what I thought of you before you told me? I said something like that. She said, that is either very wise or very foolish. I said it's one of the two, I'm not sure which yet. She almost smiled. Almost. The corner of one side of her mouth and the faint line at the edge of her eye. She turned and looked at the stove, and the almost smile settled into something else, something quieter. She said 4 river sections. I said, first bend below the Ponderosa Grove to the wide meadow. She said, I know that stretch. My father took us fishing there when I was a girl. I said, what did you catch? She said, mostly trouble. My brother tried to cross the river on a log and ended up downstream. I said, did he make it? She said he always made it. He was that kind of boy, that kind of man. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said he died at 31, a horse. I said, I'm sorry. She said, everyone dies of something. It was a hard thing to say, and she said it plainly, without self-pity, and that was the moment I understood the quality I had seen in her from the beginning. She had been grieving for a long time, and had decided not to let it take her under, And that decision had cost her something, some piece of openness or ease that women who haven't had to make that decision still carry. But underneath the cost was something else, something solid. She had chosen to keep living and she had kept living, and that was not a small thing. I said, "The land needs work." She said, "What kind of work?" I said, "The lower sections are overgrown. Nobody has grazed them or cleared them in probably 15 years. The water rights are good, but you'd need to build infrastructure to use them properly. A headgate on the upper section at minimum, probably 2. She said, "Who owned it before?" I said, "A man named Forsyth. He died without family, and the territory held the land in trust for 9 years before they started looking for someone to buy it. I bought it cheap, because no one else wanted land that far from the road." She said, "You bought it cheap, and you're still sleeping in my barn." I said, "I don't spend money on things I don't need." She said, "What do you need?" I said, "At the moment, to finish this saddle blanket." She laughed, a real laugh, small, surprised, mostly to herself. She looked down at her cup and back up, and the laugh was gone, but something from it stayed in her eyes. She said, 4 river sections." I said, "It's a good piece of ground if you work it." She said, "You're going to work it?" I said, "I intend to." She nodded slowly, looking at the stove. The fire was burning well, and the light from the grate moved on her face, and she was very still. Outside, the wind dropped for a moment and then came back harder, and the house creaked but held. She said, "You're not what I expected." I said, "What did you expect?" She said, "I don't know, someone more obvious." I said, "Obvious how?" She said, "Either very proud of what he had or very ashamed of how he looked. You're neither." I said, "There's no point in either one." She said, "No, I suppose not." She finished her coffee and rinsed the cup at the basin and said good night. I sat there with the blanket and the needle and the quiet fire, and outside the snow was still coming down, and somewhere in the back room Bito made a sound in his sleep, a single soft syllable, and then was quiet again. The snow pulled back in the last week of February, and the mud season started. The creek came up and the low pasture flooded, and I moved the flock to the high ground and built a temporary pen out of cedar poles and wire that took me and Tamaz 2 days to put up. It held. Tamaz had gotten careful in the way you have to be to work with wire, patient and particular, no shortcuts, because shortcuts in wire will cut you. He was 11 years old and already building that patience into himself. I told him he did good work. He looked at the pen and said it would hold. I said that was the same thing. The land started to show itself as the snow left it. Her 40 acres was better than it looked under snow. There was ground in the north field that with a hard plowing would take a decent grain crop. I told her that in March, and she said her husband had never plowed the north field, that it was too rocky, and I said it was worth a look. And we walked it together one evening, and the rocks were real but not as bad as she thought, and I said I'd dig them out if she wanted to try it. She said, "It's your work." I said, "It's your land." She said, "We're married." I said, "Yes, we are." She said it the way you say something when you're testing how it sounds, not to the other person but to yourself. Like saying a word in a foreign language for the first time, and finding out it sounds like what it means. We started on the north field in April. I broke the sod and she came out in the afternoons and helped clear rock, and Bito worked beside her and threw the small rocks and carried the big ones and complained about both. Tamaz plowed a straight furrow on his second try and stood back and looked at it with the face of a boy who was not going to say he was proud of himself but was. Something was shifting. I knew it, I didn't press it. One morning in the middle of April I found a set of wolf tracks along the east fence line. 2 wolves running together, the big one's pad print nearly as wide as my hand. They had paralleled the fence for a 1/4 mile and turned back at the creek. It meant they were looking, not hunting, but it also meant they'd come back. I spent that day reinforcing the fence, and setting a smoke ring from dried juniper around the paddock perimeter, because wolves don't like the smell, and it slows them down long enough for you to hear them. That night I heard them, not close, maybe a mile up the valley, and I was awake before the sheep started moving, some reflex that fires before you know you're conscious. I dressed in the dark and went out with the rifle. I didn't go after them. You don't go after wolves in the dark on their ground, not alone. I positioned myself at the corner of the paddock where I had sight lines in 2 directions, and I waited. They didn't come. After an hour the sheep settled down and the wolves had moved on up the valley. I stood in the cold for a while anyway, listening. The door of the house opened. Celia came out with a coat over her nightclothes and a lantern, low wicked so it wouldn't ruin her eyes for the dark. She walked to where I was standing and looked out at the fence line and the paddock and the settled sheep. She said, "Wolves." I said, "Pair of them, they're gone." She stood beside me. The lantern moved the dark just enough. I could smell wood smoke in her hair from the evening fire. She said, "Did you sleep at all?" I said, "Some." She said, "You heard them before the sheep did." I said, "I've been sleeping light." She said, "Because of the wolves." I said, "Partly." She looked at me. I was watching the fence line and I felt her looking at me. She said, "Partly." I didn't answer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Jacob." It was the first time she had used my given name. I turned. She said, "You don't have to sleep in the barn." I said, "Celia." She said, "I'm not asking you because I feel I should. I'm asking you because I want to." I looked at her. She was looking at me straight, no evasion, the way she looked at everything. The lantern light moved on her face and she was not performing sincerity. She simply was sincere, and I understood that with her there was no difference between the two. I said, "You're sure?" She said, "I have been sure for some time. I was just waiting for you to stop assuming I wasn't." I said, "That's fair." She said, "Come inside." I said, "Let me do one more check of the fence." She said, "I'll wait." She did. In May I rode to Cimarron and met with the land agent. Gerald Holt was still there, still wearing a good coat, though this one was a different one. He spread the deeds on his desk and went through the boundary lines with me. Everything was clear. I had owned that land for 7 months and had never seen it in any season but autumn. I rode out to it the following week, 4 days up into the mountains along the Ute Fork, and I walked each section. It was good land. Not easy land, you'd have to work it, and the road access was rough, and the lower sections needed clearing, but good. The river ran clear and cold and fast, and the water rights were exactly as described. The ponderosa grove on the upper section was mature timber, the kind that had been growing for 100 years without anyone putting an axe to it. There were elk on 3 of the sections and sign of bear on the 4th, which meant the graze was good. I rode back down and told Celia about it that evening. We were sitting on the steps of the house after supper, and the boys were down at the creek, and the air smelled like wet sage and the sky to the west had gone pink and copper, and she was listening the way she listened to things that mattered, which was with her whole attention and no interruption. When I finished, she said, "When do you want to start working it?" I said, "Not this year. We need to finish your north field and get the crop in and see how the flock does on summer graze. Maybe next year, maybe the year after." She said, "That's patient." I said, "The land's been there 100 years. It'll wait." She said, you are a very patient man." I said, "People say that like it's a virtue. Mostly it's just that I learned early there wasn't much point in hurrying." She said, "What did you learn that from?" I said, "My father. He was not a patient man. He hurried everything and lost most of it." She was quiet. Then she said, "My father was patient. He farmed the same 40 acres his whole life and never made much from it, but he never lost it either. He said the land didn't care how you felt about it. It only cared what you did to it." I said, "He sounds like a sensible man." She said he would have liked you. I looked at her. She was looking at the mountains to the west, at the last of the light on them, and she said it simply, like a thing that was true and she was just saying it, and it landed somewhere in me that I wasn't expecting. I said I would have liked him, I think. She turned and looked at me. We were close together on the steps. She had her arms around her knees and she was looking at me with those creekwater eyes, and the evening light was on her, and I said, "You know I love you." It was not something I had planned to say. It was something that had been true for a while and came out plainly, the way true things come out when you stop carrying them. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I know, I've known for a while." I said, "You might have said something." She said, "You might have." I said, "Fair point." She said, "Jacob." I said, "Yes." She said, "I love you too. I don't know exactly when it started. I think it was the night of the wolves when I came outside and you were already there." I said, "I was just doing a job." She said, "I know, that was the thing." She put her head against my shoulder then. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance, just that. She leaned her head against my shoulder and looked out at the last light on the mountains, and I felt the weight of her, not heavy, just real, and I put my arm around her and she settled in, and we sat there until the boys came back from the creek. There was a hard week in March that I still think about. The lambing had been going well. I had been sleeping in 4-hour stretches for 2 weeks, up every night to check the ewes that were close, pulling lambs when they needed pulling, making sure the cold didn't take them before they'd had their first feed. March lambing in the high country is a particular kind of work, grateful work, because new lambs are a good thing, but relentless. Your hands are always cold and always needed, and you go to sleep smelling like birth and lanolin, and you don't mind because it means the flock is growing. The flood came on a Wednesday night in the 3rd week of March, not from the creek, from above. The snowmelt in the mountains above the valley had been building for a week, and there had been 2 days of warm rain on top of it, and the upper drainage came down hard, and the creek jumped its banks before midnight. I was in the barn when I heard it. Not the water, you don't hear water moving that fast and that full until it's already on you, but the sheep. They have a particular sound when the ground changes under them, a low collective alarm that is different from any other sound they make. I was out of the barn before I had my boots fully on. The water was coming across the low pasture, dark and moving fast, already at the east fence. The flock was in the paddock and the paddock gate was on the low side. I ran. I got the gate open and started moving sheep out. In the dark, in running water that was coming up around my ankles and rising, with 30-odd animals that don't want to move in the direction you want them to move. I pushed them toward the high ground on the north side, where I had the temporary pen from the February blizzard. It was above the flood line. I could see that from where I was. I had looked at the drainage of this property long enough to know where the water would stop. I had about 20 sheep through when the water hit the fence on the low side of the paddock, and the fence came down. Not all of it. 3 posts, maybe 4, the corner section where the ground was softest, and the water came in and the remaining animals panicked. What happened next is not entirely in order in my memory. There were sheep in the water, sheep on the fence, sheep running in 3 directions in the dark. I was chest deep in the paddock at one point pulling a young ewe off a wire that had caught her back leg. She was frantic and strong, and I got the leg free and she went under and then up and found her feet and was gone, which was what I wanted. The water rose to its peak sometime around 2 in the morning and then began to drop. By 3 it was back within the banks. I found my sheep in the gray pre-dawn light scattered across the north high ground, some in the pen, some along the fence line, some in the brushy draw above the barn. I counted them as the light came. I was missing 3. I found 2 of them just after full light, down the valley where the creek curved, and had caught them against a log jam. One had a cut on her flank from the wire, but both were alive. The third I found in the brush above the road. A young ram that had apparently climbed straight out of the flood and kept going uphill until he hit the road and stopped. He was standing in the road looking at me with the general expression of an animal that has had a very bad night and would appreciate someone explaining it. I was muddy to my collar and soaking, and my right hand was cut from the wire in the paddock, and I had been up since before midnight. I walked the ram back to the pen and put him in and latched the gate and stood there with my hand on the rail for a moment. I heard the house door. Celia came across the yard with a lantern in one hand and a coat thrown over her night clothes. She came straight to the pen and looked at the sheep and then at me. She said, "Are they all right?" I said, "All accounted for. 2 are cut, nothing serious." She said, "You?" I said, "I'm fine." She put the lantern down on the rail and took my right hand in both of hers and turned it toward the gray light. The cut across the palm was not deep, but it was long and it had bled a good deal through the night. She said, "Come inside." I said, "I need to check the fence." She said, "The fence will be there in an hour. Come inside." I went inside. She sat me at the table and cleaned the cut with hot water and cloth, and then bound it with a strip of flannel that she tore with a practiced efficiency that told me she had done this before, for her husband, for the boys. When she was done, she tied it off neatly and kept my hand in both of hers for a moment, not examining it anymore, just holding it. I said, "Celia." She said, "You could have come and woken me." I said, "It happened fast. There wasn't time." She said, "Jacob, you could have come and woken me." I said, "I know, there wasn't time." She looked at my face. She said, "How much is lost?" I said, "The south fence, maybe 40 feet, 2 posts, it's fixable." She said, "The crop." I said, "The field drained well, I don't know yet. Probably some loss on the south end, where it was still low from planting." She said, "We'll manage." I said, "Yes." She was still holding my hand. She looked at it and then back up at me. She said, "Tomas heard the water in the night. He wanted to come out." I said, "You kept him in." She said, "He's 11. Yes, I kept him in." I said, "Smart." She said, "He was up at the window. He watched for you." I thought about that. The boy up at the window in the dark watching the south field for me. Not his father, me. Someone else's boy watching for me in a flood. I said, "I'll tell him about the ram. He'll like that. Finding the ram on the road." She said, "He'll want to hear all of it." I said, "He can have all of it." She looked at me. The morning light was coming in the east window now, pale and flat after the wet night, and she was looking at me the way she looked at me when she had something she was deciding whether to say. She said, "You didn't wake me." I said, "I know." She said, "I want to know the next time. I want to be out there with you." I said, "Celia, it was a flood. It was dark and the water was moving in." She said, "I know what it was. I grew up on this creek, and I want to be out there with you." I looked at her. She was utterly serious, not demanding or dramatic, just clear. She was telling me what she needed, and she was right that it was a fair thing to need. I said, "All right." She said, "All right." I said, "Next time I wake you." She nodded once. Then she got up and put the coffee on and went to the back room to get the boys up. A few minutes later I heard Bito complaining about something, the cold floor, probably, and Tomas's quieter voice, and then both of them coming down, and Bito said something about the water and Tomas said it was a flood, a real one, and Celia said get dressed and eat first. Tomas came and sat across from me at the table while his mother made breakfast. He looked at my bandaged hand. He said, "Are the sheep okay?" I said, "All of them, even the young ram you've been watching." He said, "He was in the water." I said he was, found him on the road at first light, just standing there looking at me. Tomas's face did the thing it did when he was deciding whether something was funny. Then he said, "Did he know he was on the road?" I said, "I don't think he cared. He'd been through a flood." Tomas nodded seriously. He said, What do we do about the fence? I said we fix it. You and me, today if the ground's dry enough by afternoon. He said, I'll be ready after lessons. I said, Agnes isn't coming today. The road'll be mud. He thought about that and said, then we can go after breakfast. I said, after breakfast. He nodded and went to wash his hands, and I sat there at the table with the morning light on the yard outside where the flood water had gone down and left the grass flat, and the south field dark and wet, and the mountains to the north were clear and cold above the line of the valley. My hand ached under the bandage. The coffee was good. Celia set a plate in front of me and paused with her hand on my shoulder for just a moment. Not long, not a ceremony, just a moment. And then she went back to the stove. That was the week I understood that what we had built was not going to come apart. Not from weather, not from Abernathy, not from the ordinary hard turns that land and seasons deal you. We were too solid. We had been building something real without thinking much about it, and the flood had shown me what it was, a life that holds when the water comes up. Summer came. The North Field came in with a grain crop that was not spectacular, but was real, actual grain out of ground that nobody had planted in years, maybe ever. Tamaz helped me cut and bind it. He worked all day in the heat without complaint. At the end of the last day, he stood in the field with his hands on his hips and sweat running down the sides of his face, and he looked at what we'd done and he said, "That's a good stand." I said, "You did half the work." He said, "More than half." I said, "More than half." He grinned. The first time I had seen him grin, it changed his whole face. The flock did well on summer graze. I took them up into the high meadows in June, and they put on weight, and the shearing in July gave me wool enough to sell well at the Cimarron market. I came back with enough money to buy good seed for the fall planting, and to fix the roof on the barn, which had been soft in one corner since I arrived, and to set aside a sum that I put in the bank in Cimarron against the day when we would start working the river sections. Celia came with me to Cimarron for the market. The first time she had been to town since the wedding. She wore the dark blue dress and her hair was up, and she walked the market beside me, and a few of the men knew me from wool business, and she talked to their wives and held her own in it, easy, with that quality of paying attention that people respond to. One of the wives, a Mrs. Gildia, whose husband ran a big merino operation east of town, asked her how long we'd been married, and she said since January, and Mrs. Gildia said you seem settled, and Celia said we are. On the ride back she was quiet for a while in that thinking way of hers, and then she said, "People were surprised." I said, "About what?" She said, "About you, about what you'd done, about the grain crop and the wool numbers and the river land. I heard two men talking near the wool barn. One of them said he'd heard you had river sections on the Ute Fork and couldn't believe it, that he'd thought you were just a sheep herder coming through for winter pasture." I said, "That's what I was." She said, "You know what I mean." I said, "I know." She said, "You never told anyone." I said, "Wasn't anyone's business." She said, "You didn't tell me." I said, "I told you when it was the right time." She thought about that for a while. We were on the road south through the high desert, the wagon moving through the afternoon heat, and the land on either side was dry and gold, and the mountains were blue in the distance, and she was thinking. She said, "Were you testing me?" I said, "No. I was waiting to see who you were before I said anything about what I had, because I didn't want it to change things." She said, "Change things how?" I said, "If you'd known, from the first conversation in the mercantile, would it have changed how you looked at me?" She was quiet for a long time. She said, "Maybe." I said, "That's why I waited." She looked at me. She said, "You wanted me to see you, not the land." I said, "I wanted you to see me. If you liked what you saw, the land would keep." She was quiet for another mile or so. Then she said, "What if I hadn't liked what I saw?" I said, "Then we'd have figured something out. I wouldn't have let you lose the house." She said, "You would have helped me anyway." I said, "Of course." She looked at me for a long time. We were in the full afternoon sun, and she was looking at me the way she had looked at the flower price tag in the mercantile, with all her attention on one thing, reading it completely. She said, "You are a strange man, Jacob Calder." I said, "People say that." She said, "I mean it as a compliment." She slid across the wagon bench and put her hand through my arm and leaned against my side, which she did not often do in daylight, not in her nature, and she held on, and we drove south through the afternoon, and neither of us said anything more for a long while. The boys needed schooling. That was the next thing. There was a school in Rayado, which was 11 miles and not practical for daily travel. Celia had been teaching them at home through the winter with what books she had, but her books only went so far. She worried about it. I had noticed her worrying about it for months, the particular kind of worry she kept to herself and only let out in small, controlled amounts. In September, I rode to Cimarron and had a conversation with Gerald Holt, who had lived in the county his whole life and knew everybody. He told me there was a woman named Agnes Prout who had taught school in Elizabethtown before the mining played out, and had recently come to stay with her daughter outside Rayado. She was 60 years old, had taught for 30 years, and was bored. Holt seemed certain she'd teach private if the arrangement was right. I rode to the daughter's place and introduced myself to Agnes Prout. She was a small, fierce woman with gray hair and very steady eyes, and she told me in the first 5 minutes of the conversation that she did not tolerate wasted time, hers or a student's, and that she charged $12 a month and she would not negotiate on that. I said $12 was fine. She said she'd come on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and whoever built her the best schedule would get her best work. I said the boys would be ready by 7 in the morning on those days. She said good, because she believed in starting early. When I told Celia that evening, she looked at me for a moment with something she almost never showed, which was being caught off guard. She said, "When did you arrange this?" I said Tuesday. She said, "You rode to Cimarron on Tuesday." I said I was going to look at seed prices. She said, "You did not say anything about a school teacher." I said, "I didn't know if it would work out until I talked to her." She said, "Jacob." I said, "She charges 12 a month. I think she's worth it." She came across the kitchen and put both hands on either side of my face and looked at me. She said, "You did not have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "Those are not your boys." I said, "They are now." She looked at me. Her hands were still on either side of my face, and she was close, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite crying, not anything as simple as that, but the look a person gets when something they had given up hoping for comes back to them unexpectedly. That look is not a small thing to see on a person's face. It is a substantial thing. It goes through you. She kissed me, then she said, "You are a good man." I said, "Ask me again in 20 years. She said, "I intend to." Before I get to Agnes Prout, I want to say something about the months between September and the schoolteacher arriving, because those months were where I understood slowly what I had gotten into, and I mean that in the best possible sense of the phrase. There is a particular kind of accounting that happens when you have spent years alone. You get used to knowing exactly what you have, the weight of your bedroll, the count of your flock, the money in your boot, everything tallied and portable, everything yours and therefore manageable. You don't have to consult anyone. You don't have to explain anything. It's a clean life in the way that empty rooms are clean. I had not understood until that fall what I had been missing. Not the obvious things. I'd had those, a woman's warmth, a roof I didn't have to share, meals I didn't have to make from scratch in the dark on a campfire. Those were good and I was glad of them. But the thing I had not expected was this, the weight of being known. It is one thing to be respected by people who don't know you, people who see the work you do and take the measure of it from the outside. That is a decent thing and I had always valued it. but it is a different thing entirely to be known by one person who sees all of it, the work and the long silences and the tiredness at the end of a hard day, and the particular way you go still when something is worrying you, and who still sits across the table from you in the lamplight and is there, wholly there. Celia knew me by October. I don't know exactly when it happened. It crept up the way river water creeps up in a wet spring, gradual and then not gradual at all. One morning I came in from early chores and she had coffee ready without asking, and she looked at me over the rim of her cup and said, "What's worrying you?" And I said, "One of the young ewes is off her feed." And she said, "The gray one or the one with the split ear?" And I stood there with my coffee, and it took me a moment to understand what had happened, which was that she had been paying attention to my flock, my particular flock, each animal, the way you pay attention to something that matters to you because it matters to someone you care about. I said, "The gray one." She said she was slow coming in last night too. I noticed. I said, "You were watching the flock at dusk." She said, "I was hanging wash. She came in last." I said, "She'll probably be fine. Sometimes they just go off for a day." She said, "I know, but you should check the back teeth. My father always said to check the back teeth first." I checked the back teeth, cracked molar back left. I had the sheep down to Cimarron to the man who handled large animals, and he pulled the tooth and she was fine in 2 weeks. I don't know if I would have found it as fast without Celia saying something. Maybe, maybe not. But the point is that she noticed. That's the point. She was paying attention. There was a morning in late September when the boys were doing their lessons at the kitchen table in Celia, and I were out fixing a break in the west fence. A long, quiet morning with the smell of sage and cooling grass, and we worked without talking much and the work went well. And at some point, she was on one side of a fence post, and I was on the other side, and we were both pulling wire taut in opposite directions, and she looked at me through the wire and said, "You know what Tamaz said to me last night?" I said, "What?" She said, "He said he wants to know how you decide when to move the flock and how far. He wants to understand the whole system." I said, "I'll show him." She said, "He knows you will. That's why he asked me instead of you." He asked me because he didn't want to seem like he was asking for too much. I looked at her through the wire. She said, "He likes you very much. He just doesn't know how to say it yet." I went back to the wire. After a moment I said, "He doesn't have to say it." She said, "I know. I told him that. There are things that happen quietly, without ceremony, and you don't know they have happened until you look back at them from a distance. One of those things happened somewhere in that September fence work, in the morning light with the sage smell and the wire between us. Something settled into place. Some question I had been carrying without naming it stopped needing an answer. I was home, that is all I can call it. I was home. The conversation with the man named Driscoll happened in October, and I want to be accurate about it because it mattered. I was in Cimarron at the wool merchant's office sorting out a payment when a man came in behind me and stood too close in the way of men who want you to know they're there. I turned around. He was 40 or so, broad across the chest, trail dirty, and he had the look of a man who has spent time deciding what to do before he came in the room. I didn't know him. He said, "You're the sheep man with the Ute Fork sections." I said, "I have land on the Ute Fork." He said, "Forsyth land." I said, "Was Forsyth land? My land now, 8 months." He looked at me for a moment. He had steady gray eyes and a patience about him that was not calm but contained, the kind of patience that's actually held tension. He said, "You know that stretch has been run informally for 15 years. Cattle, rancher named Abernathy, out of the Upper Valley." I said, "I know who Abernathy is." He said, "The deeds don't change the fact that the grazing has been going on. 15 years is a long time." I said, 15 years of grazing doesn't give a man a deed." He said, "It gives a man a relationship with the land that a piece of paper doesn't always respect." I said, "I understand what you're saying. I'm telling you that the deeds are clear. The water rights are clear, and I intend to develop those sections for my own use over the next several years. Anyone grazing Abernathy's cattle on my sections will need to make other arrangements. He said, "You're a sheep man." I said, "That's right." He said, "Abernathy doesn't like sheep." I said, "Abernathy's feelings about sheep are not my concern." He looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. He was trying to read how far I'd move, and I wasn't moving. He said, "I'd think carefully about this, Mr. Calder." I said, "I've been thinking carefully about it for 8 months. Have a good day." He left. I finished my business with the wool merchant and rode back to the valley. I didn't say anything to Celia about it that night. I thought about it, though. Abernathy was a real man with real cattle and a real history on that ground, and Driscoll's visit was not a random event. It was a message sent by a man who was calculating. The question was what he was calculating toward. I found out 3 weeks later, when 2 of Abernathy's riders came across my south fence. They didn't cut it. That was the notable thing. They just crossed it, 2 of them on horseback in the late afternoon, and rode slowly along the south field boundary and looked at my flock. Looking and being looked at, that's what it was. A display. A message that said, "We see where you are." Tamaz was with me in the south field. He saw them the same time I did, and he stood up straight and looked at them and then looked at me. I said, "Keep working." He said, "Who are they?" I said, "Riders from up the valley. They're just looking." He said, "At us." I said, "At the sheep. Come on, this post isn't going to set itself." He went back to work, but he watched them from the corner of his eye, the way boys watch things they haven't been told the whole truth about. I let him watch. They rode along the fence line at a walk and turned at the east corner and went back the way they came. That evening I told Celia. She said, "Abernathy." I said, "Probably." She said, "He's been running cattle in this valley for 20 years. He runs a lot of it like it's his, regardless of whose name is on the papers." I said, "I know the type." She said, "My husband had trouble with him, nothing serious. But Abernathy leaned on the creek water above us one dry summer, and we were short until October." I said, "He won't do that again." She said, "Jacob." I said, "The creek water runs through my south corner before it reaches your land. If he diverts it above your line, he diverts it through my section. That changes the math." She looked at me. She said, "You knew that when you married me." I said, "I knew the lay of the land. I didn't marry you because of creek rights." She said, "But you thought about it." I said, "I thought about everything. I think about things." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do about Abernathy?" I said, "Nothing yet. I'm going to let him think about what he's dealing with and see what he decides." She said, "And if he decides badly?" I said, "Then I'll deal with it." She looked at me for a long moment, this particular look she had when she was assessing something, when she was deciding whether to trust a conclusion she'd already mostly reached. She said, "You're not going to do anything stupid." I said, "When have I done anything stupid?" She said, "You've been careful so far." I said, "I intend to stay careful." She said, "Good, because the boys have enough to worry about." I said, "Nothing's going to happen to the boys." She said, "I know that. I just want you to know that I know it." We looked at each other across the table for a moment, and something passed between us that didn't need words. An understanding. A partnership. The thing that happens between people who have decided to be in something together and mean it. She said, "Eat your supper." I ate my supper. Abernathy himself came in December. Not his riders, him. He rode into the yard on a big roan horse on a cold afternoon when the ground was iron hard, and the sky had the flat gray look that means snow within a day. He was a bigger man than I expected. Not heavy but large, long-armed, with a face that had gone leathery from 40 years outside. He dismounted at the rail and tied his horse with the unhurried manner of a man who is accustomed to arriving places and being received. He looked at the house and the barn and the paddock fence and my flock in the south field. I came out to meet him. He looked at me, I looked at him. He had probably 20 years on me and another 50 pounds, and he used both like tools without being obvious about it. He said Calder. I said Abernathy. He said, nice little operation. I said thank you. He looked at the flock again. He said sheep. I said that's right. He said, my grandfather didn't like sheep. I said, lot of people's grandfathers didn't. He looked at me then. He had expected something else, deference, maybe, or defensiveness, and I wasn't giving him either one, and he was recalibrating. He said, I've been running cattle on your river sections. I said, I know. He said, like I said to my man Driscoll, that's a long history. I said, it is, and it's over. He was quiet. He looked at the mountains. He said, I'm prepared to buy those sections, fair price. You'd come out well. I said, I'm not selling. He said, you're a sheep man. You don't need river land. I said, I have plans for it. He said, what kind of plans? I said, my kind. He turned back and looked at me directly, and there was a decision being made behind his eyes. He was trying to figure out whether I was bluffing, and I was not bluffing, and some part of him could see that. He said, there are easier places to graze sheep. I said, I'm not going anywhere. He said, this valley has a long memory. I said, I expect it does. Silence. The wind moved through the yard and my sheep called from the south field, one of them for no particular reason, the way they do. He said, what do you want for the sections? I said, I told you, they're not for sale. He said, everything's for sale. I said, not this. My wife grew up fishing that river stretch. I'm not selling it. He looked at the house. He looked at me. He said, your wife. I said, that's right. He said, Fuentes woman. I said, Celia Calder. He was quiet for a moment. Something in him adjusted. Not softened, men like Abernathy don't soften, but adjusted. He had come expecting to deal with an itinerant sheep herder with no real stake and no real root, and he was finding something different, and he was being honest enough with himself to acknowledge it. He said, she was Felipe Fuentes' daughter. I said she was. He said, Felipe was a straight dealer. I said, yes. He said, if she wants to keep that river stretch, you tell her I said her father was a straight dealer and I'll leave it alone. I said, I'll tell her. He untied his horse and mounted. He looked at me from up there for a moment. He said, you've got some nerve, I'll give you that. I said, I'm just a man with deeds. He looked at me for a moment longer. Then something happened that I had not expected. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He said, don't let your sheep drift onto my north grass. I said, I keep track of my sheep. He rode out. I stood in the yard for a minute in the cold wind, and then I went in and told Celia. She was still for a moment when I finished. Then she said, he knew my father. I said, apparently. She said, my father used to say Abernathy was a hard man but a fair one, when you got to the bottom of him. I said, he got to the bottom fairly quickly. She said, what did you say to him? I said, I told him the land wasn't for sale and that you had grown up fishing the Ute Fork and that you wanted to keep it. She looked at me. Her eyes were very bright for a moment, the particular brightness that is not crying but is the edge of it. She said, you told him I wanted to keep it. I said, I thought you would. She said, I do. I haven't been there since I was a girl, but I've thought about it, taking the boys there, fishing that stretch the way my father took me. I said, when the lower sections are cleared, we can put a road in, have a camp up there in summer. She said, Jacob. I said, it's good fishing ground. Boy like Beto will fish every rock in the river. She looked at me with those eyes and said, "It was your land that sent Abernathy home." I said, "Partly." She said, "And the rest?" I said, "I told him my wife's family had a history there. He respected that." She said, "You didn't have to bring me into it." I said, "You are in it. You're in everything. That's what this is." She stood there looking at me for a moment. Then she came and put her arms around me, not lightly, fully, both arms, her face against my chest, and she held on. I put my arms around her and I could feel her breathing. After a moment she said, into my chest, "You are a very solid person, Jacob Calder." I said, "Is that good?" She said, "It is the best thing." We stood like that in the kitchen, with the cold coming under the door from outside, and the stove ticking behind us, and somewhere out in the field, one of the sheep calling again into the December afternoon. Agnes Prout arrived the following Monday at 6:55 in the morning on a horse that moved like it resented the early hour. She tied it at the rail, walked in, asked for coffee, and looked at both boys with the frank appraisal of a woman who has taught long enough to know what she's working with in the first 30 seconds. She said, "Who's been teaching you?" They looked at their mother. She said, "Past your mother." Tamaz said, "She has mostly." Agnes said, "Good, then she's your baseline, I'll work from there." She opened a case she'd brought and took out 2 slates and 2 horn books, and a reader that looked like it had been through the Mexican War, and set them on the kitchen table and told them to sit. She looked at me on her way out that evening and said, "The younger one is quick, the older one is thorough, you have good material here." I said, "I know." She said, "You didn't make them." I said, "I know that too." She looked at me for a moment, then nodded, once, the way a serious person nods when they've assessed something and found it adequate, and went out to her resentful horse. In August we took 4 days and went to the river. I want to say that simply because it was a simple thing. 4 days away from the property with the flock left in Augusto's capable hands, and the boys packed into the wagon with bedrolls and fishing poles, and 2 days of food that Celia had been quietly assembling for a week, one piece at a time, so the boys didn't know what was coming until the morning we left. Biteau figured it out when he saw the fishing poles in the wagon. He said, "Are we going fishing?" And Celia said, "Ask your stepfather." And he turned and looked at me with eyes that were all question marks, and I said, "Ute Fork." And he made a sound that was not quite a word and climbed into the wagon. Tamaz was quiet on the way up. He sat in the back of the wagon with Biteau and watched the country change as we climbed into the mountains, the sage giving way to juniper, the juniper giving way to ponderosa, the air cooling, and the light going different the way mountain light does when you get above 8,000 feet. He watched all of it. That boy noticed things. He had been noticing things all summer, making careful observations about the land and the sheep and the way seasons worked, the way a boy notices things when he is deciding what kind of man he wants to become. The road to the upper sections was rough. It hadn't been maintained in years, and in 2 places I had to get down and move rock, and in one place we had to unload the wagon to get it up a grade that had washed out. Tamaz and Celia worked without complaint, and Biteau complained energetically, and managed to be useful anyway, which was Biteau's general approach to most situations. We came out of the trees in the late afternoon onto the bench above the river, and I stopped the wagon and we all looked at it. The Ute Fork at the upper meadow is a thing. The river comes down out of the high country and hits a wide bend where the canyon opens up and spreads out, and the water slows and goes green over a gravel bar, and the ponderosas stand on the bluffs on both sides, and there are mountains visible in 3 directions, and the light in the late afternoon comes sideways through the trees and makes the water look like hammered copper. Celia sat very still on the bench beside me. She said quietly, "It's the same." I said, "What?" She said, "It looks the same as I remember. I thought it might have changed." I said, "Land changes slow." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My father stood right there, on that flat rock at the bend. He used to stand there and cast and not say a word for an hour, and I'd sit on the bank and watch him. I said, "Sounds like a good man." She said he was. She reached over without looking and found my hand on my knee and held it, the two of us looking at the river while the boys shifted in the back, and Beto said, "Can we go down?" And Celia said, "Give us a minute." She said, still looking at the water, "Thank you for this." I said, "It's your land too." She said, "I know. I mean, thank you for making it mean something. For making it, I don't know how to say it. For making it matter again." I said, "Your father fished it. That already made it matter." She said, "Yes, but now we'll fish it too, all of us. That's different." We sat there for another minute, and then Beto said, "Can we please go down?" And Celia laughed and said yes, and he was out of the wagon before it stopped moving. We camped on the flat above the gravel bar. I built a fire, and Celia made the simple kind of camp supper that is better outdoors than any house meal. Salt pork and fried cornbread and strong coffee and dried apricots that she produced from somewhere in the provisions, and distributed with the seriousness of a woman who has rationed apricots before. Tomás and I fished until the light went. He was a careful fisherman, patient, quiet, good with his hands. I showed him how to read the water, where the fish hold when the current slows, how to mend a line so the fly doesn't drag across the grain. He picked it up fast. By the second hour he had figured out the feeding lane under the far bank, and he was working it with a focus that was something to watch. A focused boy with a fishing rod is one of the finest things there is. He caught 3 fish before dark. He held up the third one and looked at me across the water with an expression that was trying very hard not to be proud of itself. I said, "Nice fish." He said, "About 10 inches. I said, "Maybe 12. He looked at the fish again. He said, "Maybe 12. He let it go, which I had told him we would do with the ones we didn't need for supper, and watched it go back into the green water, and then he looked at me. He said, "You knew this place would be good." I said, "I'd seen the water rights in the deed. Water like this usually means good fishing." He said, "You never came up here to look at it, before you bought it." I said, "No." He thought about that. He said, "That's a lot of trust in a piece of paper." I said, "I checked what I could. The rest was a calculated risk." He said, "My mother says you're careful." I said, "Usually." He said, "She says when you take a risk it means you've thought it all the way through." I didn't say anything to that for a moment. The river moved through the last of the light, and upstream something jumped, and the ring spread and went flat. I said, "She's right that I think things through. Some of the best things I've done were still a risk." He said, "Like what?" I said, "Marrying your mother." He was quiet. He was looking at the water, but he was thinking about what I'd said. He said she was the risk. I said, "Both directions. I thought she might not. I wasn't sure it would work. We were strangers." He said, "But you did it anyway." I said, "I did." He said, "Because you'd thought it through." I said, "Because some things are worth the risk of being wrong, and because when I met her I could see who she was. That made the risk smaller." He was quiet for a long time. The light was nearly gone, and the bats had come out over the river, those small, quick shadows, and the fire on the flat above us had grown, and I could see Celia's shape moving near it and hear Beto's voice. Tomás said, "I'm glad you married her." I said, "So am I." He said, "And us, it's better now. It was bad for a while after my father, and it's better now." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's because of you." I said, "That's because of all of us." He looked at me. He was 11 years old, and he was trying to be fair about something and give credit where he thought credit was due and resist the comfort of oversimplifying it, and all of that was visible in his face. Then he nodded. He said, "Okay, all of us." We walked back to camp in the dark. After the boys were asleep, Celia and I sat by the fire. The mountains were black against a sky that had more stars than you can count, the way mountain skies do when you're away from any settlement, and the river sound came up from the bench below us steady and low. She said, "He talked to you tonight." I said, "We fished." She said, "He talked to you. I could see it from up here. He stood next to you for 2 hours and talked." I said, "Some." She said, "He's been waiting to do that. He's been careful around you, and tonight he wasn't." I said, "He's a good boy." She said, "He's a good man, nearly. He has too much of his father's seriousness and all of my stubbornness, and I don't know where the rest of it came from." I said, "The fishing, he's good at fishing." She said, "He just learned tonight." I said, "People who are going to be good at something show it from the first hour." She pulled her knees up and looked at the fire. She said, "Jacob." I said, "Yes." She said, "Will you tell me something true?" I said, "I always tell you true things." She said, "I know. I mean something you haven't said yet." I thought about it. The fire popped and a log shifted and the river ran its long note below us, and the stars were very clear. I said, "When I was living on the mountain with the flock in the fall before I met you, I used to think about what I was building toward, what all of it was for. The land, the flock, the careful management of every dollar. I knew what I had, and I couldn't quite figure out what the point of having it was." She was listening. I said, "A man alone doesn't need 4 sections of river land. He doesn't need a north field that produces grain. He needs enough and a way to keep going, and that's all. I had enough. I just didn't know what I was keeping going toward." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I know. This right here. The boys asleep in the tent and you beside this fire and the river down there and the flock back in the valley and all of us in it together. That's what I was keeping going toward. I just didn't know it yet." She was quiet. The fire moved between us, low and good. She said, "I didn't know either. I thought I was just surviving, getting through, keeping the boys together and the land together and getting through the next season." I said, "And now?" She said, "Now I am genuinely happy. I forgot what that felt like. It snuck up on me. You snuck up on me." I said, "I didn't try to." She said, "I know. That's what made it work." She slid across to my side of the fire and put her head on my shoulder, and I put my arm around her, and we sat there, while the fire burned down and the stars moved, and the river kept its long, steady sound in the dark below us. I am not a man who expects things to be given to him. I never was. I knew from early on that what you get in this life is mostly what you work for, and some of what you're willing to risk, and occasionally, if you are lucky and have paid attention, something you did not see coming. That night by the river was the something I did not see coming. I held her and I looked at the stars and I thought, I have been patient my whole life, and I did not know that I was patient for this. The fall brought a second frost early, which is a thing that happens in the high country and is not entirely predictable, and I lost a little from the kitchen garden, but the grain was already in, and the sheep were already moving to winter ground, and it didn't cost us much. The north field went into winter cover crop, which I had planted in October on good ground that had been open range this time last year. Things were different. That is a plain way to say it, but it is the true way. Things were different from what they had been when I rode into Rayado with $23 and a bedroll. The flock was 63 head now, 20 more than I had in October because of a good lambing and because I had bought 8 ewes from a man in Cimarron who needed the money. The grain had sold well. The wool had sold well. The bank account was real and growing, not large but real. The river land sat in its mountains and waited, the way it had been waiting for 15 years, unhurried. But the thing that was most different was not the flock or the grain or the money. It was this. I came in at the end of each day to a house where someone was glad I was home. I don't know how to put that more plainly than that. Celia was glad I was home, not performing gladness, not obligated to it. She was genuinely glad, The way you are glad when someone comes back that you have been waiting for. She asked me about the day. She listened to the answers. When I was tired, she let me be tired. When I had something to say, she was there to hear it. The boys were glad too, in the way of boys, which means Bito said, "Did you bring anything?" And Tamaz said something about whatever thing he was working on or learning and wanted to know what I thought. That is what boys who trust you do. They bring you in. I had not known it would feel like this. I had thought I was solving a practical problem for a practical woman, and I had been right about that but wrong about everything else. The practical woman had turned out to be more than that, and the practical problem had turned out to matter. And the life we were building together had turned out to be a life, which sounds obvious but is not, if you have spent enough years not having one. One evening in November, I was sitting at the table after supper going over the flock records, and the boys were in the back room, and Celia was washing up at the basin, and she was humming something low to herself. Not a song I recognized, just a melody, half under her breath, and she didn't know she was doing it. I knew she didn't know she was doing it because it was the kind of thing you only do when you have stopped being careful about being watched. I looked up at her and she had her back to me, and she was washing the supper dishes and humming, and the lamplight was good, and the stove was warm, and outside the wind had come up like it always does in November. I thought, this is the thing, this right here. Not the land, not the deeds in the land office, not the wool checks or the grain yield or the 40 acres that were producing now where they hadn't been. All of that was real and good, and I'd worked hard for it, and I was glad to have it. But this, a woman in lamplight at ease in her own house, humming something she doesn't know she's humming, that was the thing. She turned and caught me looking. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "You're staring." I said, "I am." She looked at me. Something in her face went quiet and warm. She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "That I'm glad it worked out this way." She dried her hands on the dish towel and came to the table and sat across from me, not in her usual chair, the closer one, so her knees were near mine. She said, "What way is that?" I said, "The whole of it, the way it all went." She said, "It might still go badly, things do." I said, "Yes." She said, "You're not worried about that?" I said, "Not tonight." She looked at me for a long moment. The lamplight was on her face, and she had that quality of stillness that I had first seen in the mercantile and had come to understand was not withdrawal but presence. She was entirely there, with her whole attention, and her whole attention was on me. She said, "When I married you, I thought you were a sheep herder with nothing." I said that was fair, I looked like one. She said, "You still look like one." I said, "The pants have gotten worse." She smiled, a real one. It was a thing I had gotten used to and still noticed every time. She said, "I used to think about the deeds sometimes in the early weeks, the river land. I wondered why you hadn't told me, and I didn't know if it bothered me or not. Because the land would have made it easier to say yes to marrying you, to trust that there was something here." I said, "And now?" She said, "Now I'm glad you didn't tell me. I'm glad I said yes to the man, not the land. Because the land would have made sense without loving you, and I do love you, and those are different things." I said, "Yes, they are." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Her hand was small and work-rough, and she held mine lightly, fingers curled around the outside of my knuckles, and she looked at me. She said, "You're a good man, Jacob, a steady man, and when I say that I mean I see you. I don't mean the land or the flock or the north field. I mean you. The man who fixed the fence before we needed to ask, who told Tamaz he did good work, just that, nothing more, who sat in the cold for an hour with a rifle to make sure we were all right." She stopped. She looked at my hand under hers. She said, "I didn't know I was waiting for that. I didn't know what I was missing until I saw it." I turned my hand over and held hers. I said, "I'm not going anywhere." She said, "I know you're not." We sat like that for a while. The lamp burned steady and the wind worked at the eaves, and in the back room one of the boys turned over in sleep. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning, coming down slow and soft in the dark, settling on the 40 acres and the north field and the paddock fence and the roof of the barn. It would still be there in the morning, all of it. The ground and the flock and the river sections in their mountains and the life we were putting together out here at the edge of everything, one season at a time, steady. That was enough. That was more than enough. I held her hand in the lamplight and listened to the snow come down, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like a man passing through. I want to say one more thing, because it matters to how the story ends. The following spring I rode up to the river sections and spent 3 days clearing the lower bench of the overgrowth that had taken hold over 15 years of nobody working it. Hard work, all of it, cutting and pulling and burning slash piles and moving rock. And on the 3rd day, late in the afternoon, I broke through a section of brush along the lower edge of the 2nd section and found what I had been looking for and not known it. A meadow, not large, maybe 2 acres, completely enclosed by the brush I'd been cutting through, invisible from the road and invisible from the river. The grass in it was deep and untouched, and the creek that fed off the main fork ran through the north edge of it under a stand of willows. It was perfect grazing ground. It had been perfect grazing ground for 100 years without anyone knowing it was there. I stood in that meadow for a while. I thought about the land agent in his new coat, the way he had handed me those deeds like I'd been waiting for them. I had not known, that October afternoon with the thorn mat in my hand and the yew trembling under me, that I was about to receive something that would change the entire course of what came after. That's how it goes. The turns that matter don't announce themselves. I rode home and told Celia about the meadow. Her eyes went bright. She said, "Show me." I said, "When the road's clear enough for the wagon," she said. "Then we'll take the wagon up in June, all 4 of us." All 4 of us. I had been alone for a long time before this, and I had not known the weight of it until the weight was gone. The flock had been company enough, and the mountain seasons, and the particular satisfaction of work done right and accounts kept honest. I had thought that was sufficient because I had not had anything to compare it to. I had not known what it was to come in at the end of a hard day and be known, to sit at a table and be seen, to have a boy at the window watching for you in the dark when the creek comes over its banks. I know it now. The snow kept coming down that night, soft and quiet over the valley, covering the north field and the repaired fence and the paddock where my sheep stood together in their patient way, not minding the cold, doing what sheep do, which is endure. They are not noble animals. They are not beautiful, but they are steadfast, and in this life, steadfast is the highest praise I know. Outside the lamplight, the world was white and quiet and enormous. Inside it was warm, and the hand I held was real. And all of it, the land and the flock and the river sections in their mountains and the boys in the back room, and the woman beside me who had married a man in rags and found out who he was, all of it was mine. Not because I had earned it, because I had stayed for it. Because I had been patient and honest and willing, and in the end a good woman had seen that and chosen it freely with her whole will. That is the only story worth telling. Everything else is just weather.